No, I am excited for this as my first public meeting in my new job here in Douglas County. My name is Katy Fitzgerald. I am the new Criminal Justice Coordinator for Douglas County. And welcome.
Welcome to you.
Thank you. I have really enjoyed my time so far the last 2 weeks that I have been in Lawrence. So I'm really looking forward to getting to know a lot of you in here. I know I have run across your names and been in meetings with you all. So I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with this community. Tonight we are hosting our final meeting to wrap up a 3-year project, I think, that we started as a county in 2019 with our researchers, Dr. Jack McDevitt and Dr. Janice Iwama, with examining the law enforcement traffic and pedestrian stops here in Douglas County. So tonight, the order will have a presentation by our researchers where they will introduce or reintroduce the study and their findings and recommendations to you all. And then we have a panel of our local law enforcement agencies. We have some questions that we've prepared for them. And then we'll also save time for questions from you all, for researchers and for our law enforcement agencies. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our researchers, Dr. Jack McDevitt, to introduce himself, and Dr. Janice Iwama.
Thanks, Katy. And let me just reiterate what Katy just said. Janice and I have done this in a lot of different communities, and we've had a lot of community meetings where there's 3 people. So this is very nice and rewarding that there's such an interest in this topic among the community here. And hopefully we'll give you some of the information that can tell you about the study and what our findings were, and we can hear from you what concerns remain, what issues you feel that we haven't addressed or whatever. We're happy to make this a dialogue. And where we are, so you understand, is that we have a draft report that you've seen references to in the media. We're presenting it to each police department, to the CJCC, to the Lawrence Commission, the County Commission, and to you, and then we're going to incorporate the feedback that we get from tonight and from the other groups into a final version of the report. So this is still an opportunity to have an impact on what we find and what we say, and we're looking forward to the conversation. As I'll just jump into where we are. Some of you have been at these meetings before, so I know you know some of this. Others may not have been, but with the goals of the study when we started out, and again, it's been a while. This is 2019 when we started the conversation about doing this, was to develop and implement a process for documenting traffic stops. Now, just so you think, if you think about police departments, they generally have, you can say to them, well, tell us about where you made arrests, and they can tell you a map with a little picture on it, where the arrest was made, all these things about the arrest. So they know a lot about their data, but they generally don't pay too much attention to the traffic stop information. And the reason that's important is the traffic stop is the most common place where we and the police interact. All of the data shows that the most common official place where we interact with the police is in a traffic stop. So it's an opportunity to build trust or to lose trust in how those traffic stops are done. So it's important to think about, how to do these well. We wanted to take, the second goal is to see if there's any disproportionalities, if any one group is being singled out for any of the traffic enforcement decisions. We'll run through some of that, what we found so far. To formulate any solutions and assist in developing any necessary procedures. Janice and I have done this in hundreds of police departments, and you get all kinds of reactions. Sometimes the police just say, no, you're wrong. Sometimes they fight with you about the analysis and the data. But here, they've been really embracing the idea that they could learn some things and maybe do a better job or continue to do a good job, depending on the area, in policing for Douglas County. So, you know, it's been a good experience to work with the agencies here. As many of you know, one thing that's different about doing this study here is that generally when we do these studies, it's because of one of two things. There's been a really bad incident that came from a traffic stop and someone was hurt or police acted badly, and that's the reason they're doing the study. Or, as in Missouri, there's a state law that mandates it, that they have to do the study. So here, the CJCC, the community, the various commissions, and the 5 police departments all came together and said, we'd like to know this information. We want to do this study. And that's unusual for somebody to invite you in and say, we want to know if there are any problems with the way we're interacting with the public in traffic and pedestrian stops. So that's a unique feature of this, and one that is something that we're you know, makes it a lot more engaging kind of dialogue. It doesn't mean we didn't disagree from time to time. It just means that we were asked to come and help. To frame where we are and what we're doing is this idea. You know, racial profiling is, if you think of it, it's a decision by a police officer, or it could be anybody, a store clerk, a college professor, whatever, that we're going to make a decision and act on the characteristics of the individual, not on the behavior of the individual. So we're going to treat somebody differently because they happen to be African American or Latino, Latinx, and that's an individual decision that a police officer or anybody else could make. As a social scientist, we can't measure that. I can't do a test that says this officer acted this way because of that. What we can do, though, is look at patterns. That if police were making decisions that, let's say, giving a citation to people of color more often than they give a citation to white folks, there'd be a pattern in the data, and we can identify that pattern. Social science allows us to do that. And if you collect enough data, and the right kind of data, then you can look at those patterns, and that's what everybody here in Douglas County has done. What we can then do is say, is it racial profiling or is it something else? Because disparities aren't necessarily racial profiling. An example might be, let's say on your street, you've got a bunch of cars speeding up and down on the street, and you think that one of the kids who lives on the street might get hit. And you call the police and you say, could you increase the patrols on my street because there's people speeding up and down the street and I'm afraid that somebody's going to get hurt? And the police come and do that and do some more traffic stops. You'd see, if that neighborhood happened to be an African American neighborhood or Latino neighborhood or Asian neighborhood, you'd see more stops of those groups as the police do the enforcement. And that wouldn't be because of racial profiling, because they were responding to community requests. So the next step of the study is to look at how these where the disparities are, and work with the agencies to identify, can you explain them, or are they the result of conscious or unconscious bias of your officers? The model that Janice and I do is to do this collaboratively when we can with police agencies. It's better to work with police and have it be a joint decision of how to react to these than it is to, order somebody to do something and, fight about it. So our approach has been to sort of look at this. I think we'll come back to it too, but one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that while any police officer can do a traffic stop, the experience in Douglas County and everywhere else is that a small number of the officers do an awful lot of the traffic enforcement. Which, like, to give you an example, 60% of the officers in Douglas County made less than 50 traffic stops in the last 2 years. 11% made more than 200. And 1% made more than 500. Now, that concentrates a lot of the effort into a few individuals, but it also is an opportunity to be able to do something about it. Because if you have one person who's got unconscious bias and is pulling people over, or giving them citation or searching them because of the color of their skin, that's not like having to change the whole police department. You have to change a small number of people and monitor them. So that's one of the things that is true here as it is elsewhere across the country. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Janice Iwama from American University, talk a little bit about the boring stuff, the analysis.
So good afternoon, everybody. So when we were doing this report, and Jack McDevitt, Dr. Jack McDevitt gave you a little bit of the background on it, our hope is to sort of approach this through a variety of different angles. If you look at all of the literature outside, there are a number of different ways of measuring whether or not there's evidence of racial disparities. One of the things we'll highlight in the beginning is to give you sort of an example of one of them, and I'm happy to talk in more detail about the other three approaches as we show you a summary of the tables, is what we call benchmarking analysis. So as you can see there, most studies, what they'll do is they'll use a census data population in order to compare those individuals who are stopped, and that's not a great measure. The reason for that is individuals who are driving through certain communities are not the same ones who happen to reside in that community, who happen to live in that community. So U.S. Census population is actually a poor measure of trying to capture whether or not there are significant disparities. The other version would be to use observational data, and that is basically to put out researchers at every single major intersection and have them capture the race and ethnicity of the person. That is very expensive and very costly. It's very costly to do and takes a very long time period to do because we also have to control for seasonal effects. So throughout the 12 months, we would have to station a student, a graduate student out here, and I don't think graduate students really want to be out in the intersections for 12 months throughout the year. The third version is traffic accident data. The reason behind that is if you have a two-car collision crash, the person who's not at fault, if you capture that data for about 12 months, that's actually an accurate representation of who's driving out there. It's the person who's not at fault and involved in a two-car collision crash. Very common accidents that happen every day across the country. That captures an actual population of who's actually driving out through the streets. We did not have that available to us. We've done that in other states, but of course that's one of the things benchmarking that agencies can consider using that actually captures the population data who's driving out on the streets. The fourth measure is called the residential population. It's also considered a driving population estimate. The idea behind it is on the stop data collection form, we basically included individuals, whether or not you were a resident or were not a resident of Douglas County. And then we pulled the US Census population and produced race and ethnic breakdowns based on the minimum age, which of course at this point happens to be 14, but they have restrictions. 15 has less restrictions. 16 really is sort of considered those with almost no restrictions. And so we capture that and compare that to the driving population, the individuals who were stopped, who happen to be residents of Douglas County, and sort of broke that down. Now, this isn't a perfect measure. There's a lot of limitations I'll talk about, but this is one approach to use. So if we were to compare the census driving data to those residents who were stopped specifically, so that's some percentage of those individuals who happen to make up the stop population data, we broke it down by racial and ethnic backgrounds, and of course this also includes Hispanics simply based on limitations with the census data, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. What we found, for example, compared to Douglas residents who were stopped, pulled over by a police officer, and those who happen to make up the census population driving age, that, for example, African Americans were 2.7 times more likely to be stopped than white residents of Douglas County. We found that whites were about equal. American Indians, Alaska Native, Asians, or two or more races were less likely to be stopped according to their census population, and of course this is the census population reflecting the driving age. So that is one approach I'm looking at this, and this of course pulls the entire Douglas County data for those residents who were stopped by police officers during the 2-year study period. This provides a summary of our approaches because I had 5 additional slides that sort of break down each approach, and it's a little bit a lot to overwhelm, but I'm happy to go into details with any of these because we do have slides. But we used about 4 different areas of approaches and broke it down by some types of approaches that fall under each type of analyses. The second one we did was what's called a multivariate analyses, and it basically controls for this idea that if we were to control for gender, age, location, time of day, time of the week, time of day, and we were able to control for a number of different factors, would we be able to predict whether or not a person of color would be stopped versus a white driver by one particular agency? And we actually, based on our final report that you'll see once we make it public, we found no significant findings, right? So we weren't able to find any significant differences across agencies for outcomes that involve, for example, citations, arrests. Discretionary searches was the one area we do highlight. So for example, in our study, when we control for a variety of factors, including whether or not contraband was found, there's about 15 measures. We also control for arrest rates. One of the things we hear from police agencies is when there happens to be more crime in one particular area, there's going to be more enforcement. We also included a control for that using local level data for every month of the year. We found that there was, again, a significant difference between persons of color being stopped and searched versus non-persons of color or white drivers being stopped and searched. So that was one area we highlighted, and that was pulling all of Douglas County data together. So that's a second area of an approach. The third approach is called the veil of darkness approach, and I'm happy to go over that in a lot more detail, but just in a really quick couple of sentences. The idea behind that is if I happen to look through a car during the daytime, I'm able to tell what the color of your skin is versus the nighttime where it's a lot harder to tell, right? So the idea is if we were to control for this notion of darkness versus daylight, and understand the idea that the distribution of individuals driving throughout the day and throughout the week and throughout the year varies tremendously based on daylight and darkness, we can specifically sample a very smaller pool in order to control an uneven distribution. So let's say between 5 and 9 p.m. is what we consider to be the veil of darkness approach, what's considered the inter-twilight period. So we went through the data and basically controlled for daylight and darkness in order to compare whether or not there was a significant difference of those individuals that were pulled over. So we basically went through the data and controlled for daylight and darkness for every day of the year using U.S. Naval Observatory's data, which gives us a specific time on when is daylight, when is darkness, and controlling for those particular hours. Based on that sample of data and sort of pulling from the stops that were conducted between around 5 and 9 p.m. and there's a specific time set for the Lawrence area, we found that there were no significant findings. There wasn't a significant difference between persons of color being pulled over and white drivers using that type of approach, right? So that's a third area of an approach. The fourth approach is what we call our post-stop analyses. And the idea behind that is if we have 10 white drivers and 10 persons of color, there should be an equal percentage of individuals who are cited and searched, right, among those two particular groups. And we did this using citations, and then we went a step further and said, well, we understand that the reasons for stopping an individual varies by the reason for stopping that. So thinking about the three major reasons for stopping an individual is equipment inspection violations, speeding 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, and other traffic violations where you sort of see the failing to stop at a stop sign, ignoring the red light. When we look at each of those, we start breaking it down at the agency level, and we start seeing some agency level differences with some disparities found within some agencies versus others. And so those are sort of the finer points, because the idea behind that, and I'll give you one particular example to sort of illustrate this. If I happen to be pulling 10 people over and they happen to be persons of color for speeding 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, and I pull over 10 white drivers for speeding 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, the percent of those receiving a citation should be about the same. When we find an uneven sample and we find that, well, 80% of the persons of color were cited for speeding 10 miles per hour over the speed limit versus 40% of white drivers who were pulled over for stopping 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, that's where we start citing it. That's where we start finding, well, that's a disparity, and that's something that agencies should start taking a look at, right? Is it as a result of one particular officer who happens to be responsible for a certain type of enforcement? Is it a campaign? What particular events led to that uneven distribution? And we start pushing agencies to start investigating that. So when we looked at the three major types of violations that also reflects a national level data, we do find significant disparities, right? And we find this at the agency level with some agencies versus others. The other area, what we did with the post-op analyses, is again discretionary searches, similar to what we did with the multivariate analysis, and we again found some significant disparities across some agencies, not all. 2 of the 5 agencies conduct the most searches, and the other 3 conduct such few searches, and they're so very rare. We weren't actually able to find any significant findings, but we presented the data to both of those agencies to highlight here is an area you have to start taking a look at. When we talk about discretionary searches, when we talk about searches that are being done either following consent, probable cause, or a Terry frisk. Those searches we consider non-discretionary, that most of the literature considers non-discretionary, are those that happen to be searches incident to an arrest or an inventory/tow, where officers are required to conduct a search after towing a vehicle. that sort of summarizes as neatly as possible as I could, and I'm happy again to talk in more detail about this, having spent quite a bit of time on this. One of our recommendations, and I'll start the recommendations off and then give it back to Jack, is we absolutely have to continue to collect this data. It is important, and I say this because when we look at all 18,000 agencies across the country, there is a very small number that collects data. When you look at the headlines, it's usually the major city agencies. There's a couple of states now, and I know we spoke to one of the county commissioners that hopes to make it a requirement for all law enforcement agencies in Kansas to collect this type of data. It's very rare to find, and it's important for law enforcement agencies to collect this data, not only to capture information in order to estimate whether or not there is any evidence of racial disparities, but also to start looking at other measures like officer productivity. The effects of officers that are actually doing, is it necessarily reducing fatalities, is it reducing crime rates, is it reducing arrest rates? And so it's important for us to, one, we encourage, of course, the agencies to continue collecting this information. From what we've heard back from most agencies, they plan on collecting this information. The second here is, of course, when we started this study in 2019, now about 3 years ago, we created a data collection form that we thought fit the local context. It was something that was very much, a lot of the elements were found with a lot of other organizations that were also collecting similar data. But we found, of course, 2 years down the line that, it needs to be tweaked. We need to break down some of the categories even further. And so some of the areas we've spoken to agencies about, for example, happens to be when contraband is found, what is that probable cause based on? Was it smell, was it plain view? Another example is speeding 10 miles per hour over the speed limit. A lot of the agencies have noted they really would like to know whether or not that individual was speeding. For example, we split the two speedings below 10 miles per hour and above 10 miles per hour, the speed limit. Agencies would like to know, did the officer cite that person because they were speeding 11 to 15 miles per hour over the speed limit, or 15 and more per hour over the speed limit, right? Something that would cause significant concern if somebody were to find somebody speeding really fast. Those are some of the data elements that we encourage agencies, because the stop data collection form we created is a starting point. It should never be the end, right? So it was a starting point for agencies to tweak and sort of come back together, and hopefully it will change based on measures that allows them to better understand, what are officers actually doing when they're conducting a stop and what are they finding, for example. So the third one is, of course, to review the stops of the officers. A lot of studies are out there, and it's a smaller number than those that are actually conducting this research. Some have an opportunity to actually look at officer level analysis. We didn't have that information available to us, and that was not something we started on in the study before. But one of the things we encourage agencies to do is to start looking at individual officers and what their roles are, what their ranks are, how many years they've been in the service, whether there are any differences across gender, across age, across race of the officers. And that also needs to be captured, because that has shown mixed results. So it's hard for me to say this is the type of officer, because if we have that information, some of our problems would be solved. But there's mixed results in sort of finding how certain officers with certain characteristics are found to result in certain outcomes, right? And how they engage in stops. And so for us, it's important to sort of keeping an eye out for these officers in order to identify what officers are sort of following up on low-level discretionary stops, where those happen to be, have less discretion, where they're not required to conduct that stop, versus high discretionary stops, and sort of differentiating between that. The fourth area is, of course, following up with the areas of disparities. We found that no one agency had disparities across the board when we talk about searches, arrests, and citations. There was actually a lot of differences across agencies, and this is a reflection of how different law enforcement agencies is and how much local context really matters. And so when we went through each individual agency, we found that some agencies were found to have significant disparities in 2 out of 3 areas, some 1 out of the 3 areas, and some none. And so for our standpoint is, because this is a data collection that will hopefully continue moving forward, that agencies should consider and create actions and objectives that go behind where those areas of disparities are to be found, right? And investigate further in order to determine, are those legitimate versus illegitimate disparities? And is it based on one officer's action versus another's, or is it based on a policy that was put into place and whether or not there need to be changes made? So trying to follow up on those particular areas where we find there to be significant disparities.
We're going through this very quickly. I apologize for that, but I want to give you some time to have questions and also to hear from law enforcement in the room. So the last couple of recommendations are that it's really important that the police come back and tell you what they're doing. They have to communicate back to the community, whether it's through official groups like the CJCC or whether it's to come into community meetings like this. You know that it matters to the agencies that their officers and their deputies are treating people fairly. And they should be making public reports on a periodic basis to groups who are interested in hearing those reports. It's not good enough to just keep it within the agency. You got to talk to the community about what you're doing to make it safer. The other recommendation that we have here is to think about it. There's a program out there, about 120 agencies around the country are doing it, and it's geared to create trust between the community members and the police. And it's called the Lights Out program. And basically what it does is solicits from local businesses funding so that when you pull someone over for a traffic, for an equipment violation, their tail lights out or their headlights out or something like that, instead of giving them a ticket, which costs them a fine on top of getting the car fixed, you give them a voucher that helps pay for some of the costs of getting the car fixed. And so if you got pulled over and you had to get your headlight replaced, an officer would give you a voucher that says, here's $50 towards replacing your headlight. And it seems like the kind of program that will build trust. It's around the traffic accidents, and it's one of the things that is something worth considering for Douglas County. So I'm going to come to an end here and reiterate what Janice said, which is what we found was that there wasn't widespread disparities in any agency, but every agency has an area that they have to look at and continue to monitor. And some of them have 2 or 3 areas. And you'll see in the report, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's 58 pages long, so I don't, unless you want to go to sleep really early, it takes a while. But a couple of other things that are really important that I think you should know, is that one of the things that's different about Douglas County is the police in Douglas County give more warnings than citations. And that's different from around the country. Most of the police departments give more citations than they give warnings. And Douglas County gives more warnings. So what the police have told us is that they don't want to tax people when a warning could get them to change their behavior. So that's one thing that's helpful. And the second thing is that the police in Douglas County, when they do search someone, are much more likely to find something on that person than from other places. They still have searches that don't, but about 50% of the searches in Douglas County have some contraband, and across the country the average is about 25%. So they're twice as likely to find stuff on individuals. But there are still places to do better. So I'll stop here and we'll have the police panel. And then Janice and I will be happy to answer any questions. Get to the end.
Thank you, Jack and Janice. Having heard your presentation, I think 3 or 4 times in the last couple of days, that is the quickest that there's a lot of information that they condensed, and we're not, with the time constraints, didn't have time to really discuss. So I would encourage you all to reach out to them and ask questions that you have. So for now, I'm going to try to turn this projector up because I didn't think about that. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't realize it's doing this, but I did say it. I was listen.
So I'll get better with the technology and all this stuff as I do this. But so we're going to shift gears a little bit now and welcome our law enforcement and representative for a couple of questions that we have prepared for them, and then open the floor up to questions from you all for our panelists and also our researchers. So representing the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, we have Undersheriff Stacy Simmons. From the University of Kansas Police, we have Deputy Chief John Dietz. From Eudora Police Department, we have Chief Wes Lovett. And at the last minute, very graciously, representing and very appreciative of, we have from the City of Lawrence, the City Commission, Commissioner Lisa Larsen, filling in for Lawrence Police Department right now. So we have 3 questions, so I will just kind of go through and ask each of those, ask one question, give all the panelists an opportunity to provide their answers, and then at the end of those 3 questions, then we'll kind of turn it over to you all. So the first question that we posed to our law enforcement agencies here in Douglas County was, why did your department decide to participate in this study, and has it been valuable? So I'll start with you, Undersheriff Simmons, and we don't have a microphone, so if I need to pass this around, y'all let me know.
Yes.
Do we want to pass that?
Yes.
Sorry,
Undersheriff Simmons, thank you. Thank you all for coming today, being a part of what we're all doing here, as not only as a law enforcement agency, but our community working together. So thank you. Yeah, you wanted it. That's why we're doing this study. The community said this is what we want, so we're on board with that. We're transparent with the Sheriff's Office. We want you to know who's in and out of our community, why they're being stopped, why they're having contact with law enforcement, what that enforcement action is, what the outcome is, and we wanted it as well. We want to know those exact same things. So that's really the 2 main reasons. One also is that they talked about earlier, which is for productivity of the Sheriff's Office. We're your Sheriff's Office, we're your local law enforcement, one of your local law enforcement agencies, so I think it's important to know what it is we're doing, not only to keep our community safe, but also for you to know what we're doing basically at all times.
You're probably going to hear a lot of redundancies in what we say. So I appreciate everybody coming and knowing that people care about the work we put into this and what we've done about it. As a department that's driven by procedural justice, legitimacy, and community policing, we decided to participate in this study to be sure our practices are in the best interest of all members of our community, and if there is a problem, to number 1, identify the issue, and number 2, take the necessary steps to address the issue. At KU, we have all types of people that come to KU. We want to do what's best for that community, and hopefully they trust us to do that, and it builds relationships, which is part of what we need to be doing anyway. The study's been valuable to us. The second part of that question I almost forgot. It's been valuable to us to identify problematic areas. What's interesting, kind of different about our department, is we're also involved in a memorandum of understanding with Fort Hays State University for de-escalation. They're part of a study for, they handle all this training for de-escalation. Every month we have to send stats as part of that MOU that we're in. We incorporate the stats we get from the stop data into that process. So we've been able to get the data we're collecting, we've been able to use that in a lot of different areas, not just our stop data, but other things we're involved in as well.
I forgot the valuable part. I'm new at this. The sheriff was much better at this than I am, but he is sick, so if you can just bear with me, I'll get it. The valuable part, community engagement is huge for us. The Sheriff's Office. So just real quick, anyone from Baldwin, Eudora, Compton, Clinton, out in the county? Anybody here from Lawrence? Anybody else? Okay, anybody else? Okay. So obviously the Sheriff's Office has jurisdiction everywhere in our county. But a lot of times the people don't really know what we do, and they only see us at the fair because it's a county fair. So really, this is important to us because I know this seems kind of a little bit crazy, but this is a lot of our community engagement. We give 79% across the board warnings to people. So part of our job is education when we get to meet the people, but we did 6,584 car stops or had contacts during this period. So that's a big deal for us because that's 6,584 times. I'm sure we got to meet some people more than once, but it's a big deal for us because that's community engagement for us, and it also gives people an opportunity to see who we are as well. So yeah,
Fortunately, I retired from an agency that had been doing this actual stop data for over 20 years. So I saw firsthand how it worked. I knew that it worked, and so I was excited when Jack and Janice brought this study to us. So obviously the most valuable thing that I take from this is you just as a chief, you just want to make sure your department's doing the right thing. And you see them make traffic stops and you hear them make traffic stops, but are we doing the right thing and being impartial to the citizens? So I think that was the most important thing I took out of this. We actually adopted in our agency from this, every 4 months, we do a traffic stop review with officers. And we sit down with them, we pull random traffic stops, make sure that they're being safe, make sure they're being professional. Courtesy is given to all the people we stop. So we developed now that procedure that we kind of take it one step further, and every 4 months we'll just pick random traffic stops, sit down and just make sure we're not only being impartial, but we're being professional as well.
So you know how they say that 90% is just showing up? Well, this is what happens to the other 10%. Wind up getting hooked into doing this. No, this is great. I really do appreciate this opportunity. And the Chief of Police, Rich, couldn't be here tonight, so he has given me some of his comments. But since you have me up here, I'm going to give some of my own comments too, so bear with me, please. So on the first questions, why did the department decide to do this? And from Chief Lockhart's perspective, he wasn't here when this was decided several years ago. I was actually on the CJCC when Jack first started this study, and there was a lot of discussion going on about who to hire, what do we do, what it's going to look like, and there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and a lot of very good discussion about how this was going to proceed, and I really appreciated all that. And the fact that the CJCC worked through it and came together and was hired Jack, and it was a great decision. And then I rotated off the CJCC, and I may be back on here this next year, we'll see. But from the chief's perspective, he learned about the voluntary participation in this process when he was in the interviewing process for getting the job. In his list of pros and cons, he put it on the pro side because he thought that it was really telling that a community would volunteer to do this and not be necessarily mandated to do it. So, and he was, that was a really good point for him. And it's an indication of a sound department with good people that are working for it. So, and he said in Missouri, they're actually mandated to do this. They've been mandated to collect this data for over 20 years. And so the idea that we're doing it voluntarily says a lot about us and about our community. And he has indicated since he's been here, he has found this process to be extremely valuable. He believes that the investigation is valuable, that the awareness is very key to what's being produced, as well as a discussion for discovery as well as solutions. He did want to extend the thanks to the study group. Appreciate that very much. And from my own standpoint, I do think it's been very valuable. I remember when I was first on, a lot of our discussions were about what data to collect, how we're going to go about collect, what do we collect now, and what do we need to be doing. And there was a lot of discussion in small rooms about what we should be doing. And what the great thing is that we all came together and came up with what we felt was important. And we're collecting that data now. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Larsen. And that is actually a good segue into our second question, which is, has the process of data collection been challenging for your agency, and why or why not? And so,
Sure. Well, the chief has indicated that it has been challenging because there wasn't anything in place on how to do this. There was no how to do this, and so essentially we made that up from scratch. So the process began as a hand process, and it eventually went to a digital process to make it easier to do. And this information on the hand process, an officer would collect this data at the end of the stop. And that was in addition to all the other data that he or she had to collect, such as from the body camera, any sort of citation information. That was also what they had to collect. The chief has indicated that the departments are very committed and will continue to collect this data, the stop data, and they've even put into the budget some new software that will capture and report the relevant data when an officer runs a license or identification. So that way I'll be automatically captured versus having to manually do it.
Yeah, there were some difficulties in the beginning. You know, in our line of work, very seldom do we ever ask a patrolman to do something less, you know, as far as paperwork goes. So when we, you know, it was a little bit of a challenge to get them on board with this, but I think as long as they can, you know, you explain it and tell them why, and there's very good reasons behind it, then they buy into it. I think COVID had a little bit of, made it more difficult. We had to extend it a few times. And so the deadline kept getting moved back. And each time you tell somebody we're almost done, okay, we're almost done now again. So I don't think it made it any easier, but it's one of those things too, it's repetitive. Once you start doing it, you get used to it. Then they kind of forget about the extra steps that they have to take after a traffic stop. So I think everybody's been bought in now after it's been 2 or 3 years. So I think those challenges are in the past now.
Change can be challenging, right? And it was for us as well. Officers are very regimented in car stops. I call out my location, I get out of the car, make sure the lights are right, I make sure the cameras are on. And we added another step of filling out another form. And I don't know about LPD, we're still in the old age, it's still a form for us. We went through different software packages and tried to figure out, you know, how can we make this digital. At the end of the day, for us in our situation, it was just easier to fill out a form and put it in a database and then send it to the researchers. And that's still how we're doing it today. And, but like Chief Lovett said, it's getting officer buy-in. Telling officers we're not out to get you, we're out to hopefully prove we're doing things right. And once we get that point across, I think we got better buy-in than what we might have otherwise.
So one thing, cops hate wanting to change, and that stays to stay the same. So it's really, it is just another challenge for them in this day and age when things are dangerous for all of us to keep their head down and filling out small forms. But we do it, and it's working. There are a few things in the beginning that we realized, maybe 6 months in, that there were some tweaks that need to be made for the form, which we're going to be doing. We didn't want to skew any data, obviously, by changing things up as it was going. I think we talked about that earlier, which is searches. One of the issues that the sheriff's office had with the study was a disparity was searches. I think we could kind of work through those things just by changing the form a little bit on what those probable cause searches were actually for, and how, like whether it's plain view or odor or something like that. So I think that's something that we're working toward. Also speed, which you talked about earlier. You know, municipalities, 10 miles an hour is maybe significant in some areas, but 10 miles an hour in the county is not as significant. We have a lot higher speed issues in the county. Okay, so some of you travel outside of Florence. It's good. It's good. So we have a lot of those, and clearly on probably K10, 59, you've experienced that. So that's one of the areas we feel like we need to make some changes in. So.
Okay, and our last question has 3 different parts. How is your department planning to use the data? What are your next steps, and what challenges, if any, do you anticipate with this?
We are actually looking at data now. I think everyone is. The study's been around for a while, so as we get in preliminary reports, we've been looking at some of these areas where it's shown disparities. There's been some issues. I think one of them also for us was traffic violations of equipment that were higher for the sheriff's office than anyone else. So we're delving into that. So we're looking at all of the areas, whether it's a high or a low disparity. those things are all important to us in every single category. That 58 pages has a lot of information in it. So it's a good read, it's professionally done, but it's a lot. So it's gonna take a little bit, we're working through those things. For searches, what we did was we went back to all the searches that we could get on our server that hadn't fallen off. So what that means is after a year, they basically call it waterfall, where it just kind of falls off and lets more room for more information. So we went back, we took all those searches that we could get, and we reviewed those one by one individually. And so the challenge on that is we didn't find anything that violated the law. We didn't find anything that was a bias, but then there's always a situation of how did it get to the search. So those are things we're looking at. We don't want you to feel like we're just, sending those things off. And once we look at them, they're done. It's never going to be done. It's always going to be constant. We're always going to collect this data. We're always going to continue to look at this data. We're also looking at, are changes in policy necessary? Is additional training necessary? Is the culture of our organization necessary? For us, for municipalities, actually I can't speak for everybody. I know Lawrence Police Department has basically a fix-it ticket, where if you get a ticket for a violation, you can get it fixed within so many days, then it's essentially just goes. We don't have those. We write off state statutes and not municipality and not municipal statutes. We don't have that. So if you get a tail light, a headlight violation, it's going to cost you a lot. Those tickets are very, very expensive. Those are state statutes. They're set. We have nothing to do with those. And you got to work a few hours before you pay off one of those tickets. So we try not to write those tickets, but we did find a disparity where we actually had more than we thought we would. And so clearly we're going to delve into that and figure that out. Generally what happens is when we have, say, a driving under the influence, whatever that initial stop was for, whether it was for speeding or a violation, tag light, headlight, we'll write that ticket to go with the report to send to the district attorney's office. But we're also finding that that wasn't necessarily the case. So again, those are some of the disparities that we've already been looking into. As far as training goes, I know that training is, I don't want to say it's a buzzword, but really people are like, oh, you need more training, you just need more training. That's not necessarily the case. We need good training. We need updated training. Since the 90s, bias-based policing training has been required by state law, and we do that every year, the requirements and then so on. So we're taking care of that. There was yesterday, I can't remember who said it, but training for supervisors for this. So that's definitely something that's important to us. So, we want to know who the drivers are in our community, not just the residents. Right? So we want to know who's in our community. The bypass, anybody been on that thing? The 2-lane? Is the busiest 2-lane highway in the state of Kansas. Over 20,000 vehicles pass through that a day. So that's additional traffic for us. That's additional, 120,000 people live in our community, plus the 20,000. Some of those are commuters, some of those are residents. So there's a lot of variables that go in to these statistics, and these are the conversations that we want to have when it comes to disparities about maybe why this is happening, and getting information from our community about maybe why these things are happening. I'm a talker. I'm not good at it, but I'm a talker and I'll get off in the weeds. So challenges. So this is something I've been thinking about for a really long time. We have a lot of meetings. We talk about racial disparities. We talk about contact. We talked about the contact study. Maybe some of you are aware we're talking about disparities in our correctional facility, also run by the sheriff's office. So there's a lot of things going on in our community right now about race, about gender, about ethnicity, about law enforcement. And I find that these conversations sometimes aren't as honest as they need to be. And people immediately be on the defensive, and I will tell you that I'm one of those people. I'm proud of what I do as a law enforcement officer. But I also understand that there's perception and truth from the public toward law enforcement. So I think those conversations really need to be open and honest. And we need to just check it at the door and really figure out what's going on here. And that's both sides, right? We have questions for you, you have questions for us. Like, how can we work together as a community? How can we work together where it's not divisive, where it's not this side or that side? And I'm really passionate about this subject, so I'm kind of glad that the sheriff has COVID. Is that a HIPAA? Okay. But here's what I'll tell you. These are some of the challenges. Douglas County is not the national narrative, right? We're not Boston, we're not Chicago, we're not Kansas City, we're not any of those things. We are your local law enforcement agencies. And so when you see things on the media and you see things about, what's going on all over the country, we see those things too. And we do at times get a little defensive because sometimes we don't feel like we get the support. And I know that you feel like you don't get the support. So that's something that we have to work through to make sure that we're all working together on this to make sure that we have a safe community. There's a human factor in some of these numbers that we don't always talk about. And these are some of the honest conversations that we need to have, right? So when we talk about, you've got 10 car stops of people of color, and you've got 10 car stops of white individuals, then it should be in your mind, right, the same across the board, right? If you give eight people of color tickets, you give 8 white tickets. The human factor in this is every car stop is different. Every situation is different. Every call for service is different. Every single thing is different. And when you talk about a human factor, you're talking about just how the interaction of those folks go on that car stop. Now, is that right or wrong? I don't know. But it's the truth. It's the human factor, okay? It's, if I have 5 tickets on my record, where's the media today? The media's in here? Please do not correct that. Please do not correct that. I have 5 tickets on my record, okay? Was I speeding? Yep. I will not run a stop sign, but I will speed. So when I get pulled over, and I get pulled over, I know that I'm probably gonna get a ticket. Because when that law enforcement officer runs my information, it's gonna show my history, right? It's gonna show these tickets. So clearly I'm a little learning impaired. If this is like the 6th time, that I'm about to get a ticket. So there's not gonna be a warning for me. So these are the human factors when you look at this. If somebody has a page of history, they're probably not gonna get a warning. But if somebody doesn't have history, they're probably gonna get a warning. Now, you can also look at that as if there was bias policing or racial profiling at some point, and somebody does get a ticket, that maybe they deserved a warning, well, now you have history. And so we can see how this works. But so these are some of the challenges that we have. And these are some of the conversations that we really need to look at and talk about. And it's not just, your numbers are amazing, absolutely amazing, but it's not always just about what's on the paper. There's always a kind of a backstory to every single one of those.
My answer's not near as good, so.
Sorry.
Obviously, we are going to continue to gather our stop information. A couple of years ago, our chancellor for KU, Doug Gerard, formed a task force on community responsive public safety. And their recommendations, that's a 44-page report if you care to go read that one. And part of that was recommendation B3 is to continue our stop data information. So for us, it's not necessarily, we started voluntarily with everybody else, which was one of the reasons we started, but for us, I consider it more a mandate. When the chancellor for KU is telling us to do something, we gotta do it. It's pretty simple. The challenges for us are going to be digging into the numbers and finding out why things are the way they are. Is there something going on that we're not recognizing, or is there a bias? If there's a bias, is it an unconscious bias? Does the officer recognize that's what's going on? But we plan to, dive into the numbers and see what we can figure out. We plan to look at the recommendations that Janice and Jack provided and see what we can do to implement those and what that's going to take. So that's pretty much where we're at, I think.
Yeah, with the data, it's something I've done in the past, and this is kind of break it down very simple for you. If our agency stops 5% non-white drivers, as an average, our department does that. Well, every 3 months, if you're going to go through the data, with my agency, it's 1 through 14, to the 14th officer. If the data shows that Officer A is at 12%, well, hey, we got a problem. So, in this 3 months, our department average is 5. You're at 12. Let's sit down and figure out why this is. Are you not stopping for the right things? Are you being impartial? What is the situation? So it should bring a great deal of confidence to the city, whatever city you're from, that these kind of things can be found quickly, and either we can eliminate this officer, or we can change his, get him back to the best practices that we do as an agency. So that's how we'll use the data, it makes me sleep better at night, and should make everybody else that we have this at our exposure, to where somebody can't slip through the cracks and be that guy that's at 15% when everybody else is at 5. And then the only thing that's challenging, or the one other thing that's challenging, and this is, I'm not an IT guy, but since Jack and Janice will no longer be here anymore, we have to figure out a way, and the county is helping us with this, to get our information to a system to be able to regurgitate to us. And thankfully, we like to piggyback on top of the county a lot for this kind of stuff, and that's what they're going to help us out for. But that's probably the only thing that's really challenging that I see in the future.
So the chief has given a few points here that he would like to make as far as whether the department's planning to use today. Obviously, we are going to be doing that. And he did want to express appreciation to the researchers. And when they introduced this data, they made a pretty strong statement, and I agree with this because I remember reading the report, that this data represents a decision by an individual officer. And social science cannot measure that thought process accurately, which is true. We've got the technical data that shows this person, this is what you've been doing, but we can't always know truthfully what that process was to cause that stop. And so this data gives us at least a piece of that puzzle. And so that's what we're going to use. By having the data, it allows us to address each individual officer at that level. So when we start to see the data showing potential bias, then we can sit down with that officer one-on-one and take that first step to talk to them about the data collection and what it's showing, and have that conversation. And if the trend continues, then we can take the actions necessary to address it with that specific officer. Now, I know that we did have an officer who was engaged in bias-based policing, and we could see that very clearly. And so that officer is no longer with us. And the chief has indicated he's never heard of an internally prompted investigation of bias-based policing producing an outcome within the department other than in our city. So he's not aware of that. So even before this study began, it's been aware of and monitoring officers' behaviors to ensure that bias-based policing isn't taking place within our department. With this data, it's going to allow us to monitor it on a very technical process, that this is what the numbers are showing, and this is why we need to sit down and talk with you. So I think it's going to really help us out there. And we do have a policy that prohibits bias-based policing, and the training that we do with our officers reinforces that policy. And they're going to continue to work, and we'll work diligently to make that sure that officers are making quality stops. The chief has indicated that there's always room to improve, always, and we will continue to try to do that, work to do that. So they're going to work on a process to make those improvements happen in Lawrence and to continue to analyze the data. And what the chief is doing is looking at a resource that will enable continued analysis long-term. When he was in Kansas City, they used University of Missouri at Kansas City to do some of this data processing. So they're going to look at that for that, to be able to do that. The chief has indicated that the top bullet point in the study's conclusionary remarks, he said at the county level, using a multivariate analytic approach, this analysis found no statistically significant disparities in either citations given or the rest of color, people of color. Is that true, Jack? I don't recall that one, but yeah. The chief also wanted to point out that they have already de-emphasized minor equipment violations and are writing fewer tickets this year than previous years. He does believe there's areas of improvements that's needed, and this traffic study, this process of what we developed with the stops is a really great start to do that with. He's also appreciative of the recommendations, the 6 recommendations, I believe, that have been made in the presentations. So not all of them come with a real clear solution. ABC, it's done. It's not that easy. But we're going to use the data that you gave us to continue that process. Now, that's the chief. I wanted to point, I was looking on my phone. I wasn't playing games, but I was looking on my phone, because I don't know if any of you read our financial audit every year. It's got some great information in it. And I always pick it up, and the first thing I look at when we get it, we just got ours produced, finished up this July, so I was pulling up the data. Towards the end of it, like this is on page 154, 164, is they've got hard data for our firefighters, as well as the police data that we collect. And this is about the first place I go to when we get our new audit. It's pretty exciting, actually. It really is. So if you look back, it goes back to 2012. They always do 10 years at a time. And if you look back on our our issued traffic violations, since 2014, we had a high of 15,631 tickets cited. And each year since then, it has pretty much dropped. Next year was 12,000, 11,000, 11,000, 11,000. 2019, it was 8,400. In 2020, it was 3,900. In 21, we were at 4,500. Now, 20 was COVID, remember that. So we have shown a decrease each year since at least 2014. So I think that says, we are working on it. We are actually doing it. And I know that we're not talking about jail right now, but I'm looking at those numbers, and since 2013, where we had almost 5,000 jail situations, we're now, that again has dropped every single year to where we're doing about 1,800 a year the last 2 years. So that's also something we've been working really hard on. So this is good data. If you're into financial data, this is really awesome. So take a look at that.
Thank you to all of our panelists. So we have about 22 minutes.
The library closes at 8 o'clock, so we have to be out here at 8.
Yes, so we're going to open this up, but I'm going to, we only have one mic, right? We still, okay. Yes, so we do have our researchers, and you just tell me where to take this mic, and with your question.
Put Lisa on the spot for the hard question. Yeah, the chicken unit is fine. So, Lisa, you kind of alluded to this, but just in clarification for this puzzle data, which I get all of that, LPD has a new dashboard. I'm assuming the data is being collected on there, but I don't know. So I guess I just wanted to ask that. Is it on that dashboard?
I don't know if it's on it yet. I didn't think, I know we're still developing that. And so that would be the obviously steps towards that transparency.
Yeah, we probably don't know the second part then, because I know that they have built-in early detection. So I was just wondering if that would be part and parcel to that, with the data, which would be, I would think it'd be an important piece.
It would be, and it's something that we would definitely look at.
So, okay, just curious if that was.
My question is, maybe more for the researchers, and I wondered if you looked at the county from which people were being stopped, and if there was any significant difference there, because I know sometimes there is bias in people from a particular place, rather that may or may not affect racial disparity.
Sure. Hi. So we were collecting data on whether or not an individual was from Douglas County, another county in Kansas, non-state and international. When we controlled for somebody who was non-state, and the reason for that is sort of this myth that if you happen to have non-state tag plates, you're more likely to be pulled over. That was actually not found to be significant in Kansas. When we looked at other county, it was actually such a small percentage that we weren't able to see any significant difference between that, looking at other county data, but we didn't have a specific county in Kansas that they were from. One of our recommendations is actually, rather than simply collecting whether or not somebody is from Douglas County, is actually collecting the city they're from, is what we're hoping to do, because that provides another better measure. But at the moment we collected the data collection form, we simply said Douglas County or other county in Kansas. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
This is also for the researchers. Hi. I get to see you in real life.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've
been a while.
on Zoom. Okay, so obviously the disparity in searches is very concerning. Does the data also include percentages by race of when contraband is found? Because the assumption would be that it would, if there is a racial bias, it would be much higher when you stop white people.
The answer is yes. The report has a disparity in just who gets searched, and then who gets searched and found nothing on. That we find that both of those are concerning for a couple of the agencies. Not every agency, but for a couple of the agencies are seeing people of color being searched more, and people of color being searched and not found more often.
So not as often as white people.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
No, I don't need a microphone. I talk loudly. Should we be concerned about this data? I mean, everything's not great, right?
No, absolutely not.
As we said when we started, no agency has got disparities on everything, but no agency has no disparities. So they all have areas they gotta go work on, and the most consistent one, as Janice said, is searches. The searches of people of color are more consistently biased. More officers choose to search people of color than white people in almost all agencies.
I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And the stops, which Janice started, when we look at it, African American black drivers are more likely to stop too. So those are two big things to look at across all the agencies.
I was here when this started.
I know.
I just want to be clear. All is not well.
Right.
I'm sorry, I don't necessarily need a mic either. I know that there's some disparities. What are we doing to address at this point? I mean, I know we can't do everything, but what measures are being taken to address the disparities right now?
So I'm assuming you were asking.
Whoever can answer that, I'm sorry.
So that's a good question, and it's been asked before. I think that it's been asked before in a manner, and I'm not sure if this is where you're going or this is just where my mind is we've essentially been asked to stop doing searches until we can figure out what's going on. What I will tell you is we are 100% aware of the disparity. We are looking at the disparity. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you were here the whole time when I was talking about, okay, if we were talking about searches, that's fine. So for us, we are the agency that has the highest search rate, actually I believe, for black individuals, is that right? Not people of color, but not. But is it for the whole thing? I thought it was just for, okay, persons of color. So that is us. We have the highest rate. Here's one of those conversations. Well, first let me go back. We've taken all of our videos and we've gone back and we've looked at every single one of those that we can, and those were good stops and they were good searches. And if anybody in this room wants to come and look at any of those searches, you are more than welcome to do so. We've opened that up to multiple people, nobody ever comes, but you can look. That's an issue because, you know, sometimes people think, okay, well, you're just stopping people of color. For us, I think this question was gonna get asked, okay. You know how we talk about having an honest conversation? Well, here's an honest conversation. 10 o'clock at night, between the hours of 10 and say 1 o'clock, those are high times for searches. Pull over a black male, that car ends up getting searched. Probable cause search. Who in the audience can tell me why that's probable cause search? More than likely, probable cause search for a specific thing. Who can tell me why? Go ahead.
Because it's dark and you can't see in the car.
No, the actual car stop itself, you can't see, so that's true, thank you. Most of our car stops are 70 miles an hour going one way or the other. We can't, and so that in itself is not an issue, but the search itself is an issue. Anybody know why? There's no data on this one. This is just something that we do because this is what we do for a living, okay? It's the odor of marijuana, okay? It's the odor of marijuana, okay? So that gives us probable cause to search a vehicle. So we do. Nothing's found. Why is nothing found?
Because he was caught just smoking.
Yes, done. You're right, it's gone. There's nothing there. So the form says probable cause. Yes, nothing found. Right, nothing found. So those disparity numbers are big. They're huge. We know that. All right. Next day, same time, same place, same deputy. Pulls a skinny little white guy over. All right, known drug dealer. Is that car going to get searched?
Probably not.
Probably not. Why not?
Because he's a white boy.
Because you can't smell heroin.
He's probably not smoking it.
Yeah, you can't smell heroin.
He's covered.
So that's an issue. That's an issue for us. You can't smell heroin.
Right.
Okay, that's the conversation that we don't have. We don't have. Again, there's no stats, and I can see some of you getting really mad right now. And I know this is those conversations, right? What we find is at certain times of the night, when we pull people over, the smell of marijuana gives us probable cause. Okay, we have more black folks with the smell of marijuana than we do skinny little white guys who sling heroin. Okay, and so we can't do anything about that. There's no probable cause for that, even though we know. Does that make sense? So we search a vehicle because we have the odor of marijuana. The odor of marijuana, again, we don't have staff for this. This is something that we just do when we do our car stops for those officers and those deputies. I'm sorry, not even officers. I'm not talking for any other agency, I'm talking for deputies. This is what we do. This is what we see at night. Coming and going from Kansas City or Topeka, coming and back. Those are the main thoroughfares for our car stops. And these are the honest conversations that we don't have. We don't talk about this kind of stuff. But we are going to have more searches on black people for odor of marijuana than we are on white people for odor of marijuana. Those black people are going to get searched because that's probable cause to do that. Go ahead, sir.
I'm so sorry. So
Go ahead.
When you say there is a known drug dealer, are you also saying that there is a history of drugs being in their possession? Because I guess my understanding has always been that if there was a history of drugs being under their possession, then that was an automatic search. So I'm wrong about that.
There's no probable cause for that. We can't just search someone just because we know that they're a drug dealer. That's not how it works. Right? So again,
You may ask for consent.
right, and we do, right? Because that's one of the things that they talk about was consent, and we will ask. Sometimes they say yes, and we find it. But again, these are the things that aren't on a study. These are the things that we need to talk about. These are the questions that you need to ask us. I will be 100% honest with you if I can't. If I don't know the answer, I will tell you I don't know. But I can see people right now, they're very uncomfortable. Everybody kind of sat up, and I understand, right? And that's a great question. It really is. Again, is there a staff for that? No, there's not a staff pulling over a skinny little white guy that slings heroin. So does the black guy get searched? Yep. like, I guess so some of you are thinking right now, well, you know what, marijuana is, you know, it's not a big deal. If you look what's going on in our community right now, drugs in our community are ripping our community apart. They are ripping our community apart. Heroin, fentanyl, it's, you know, yeah, the DA might not charge it, and the municipal court, I think, is like 28 cents or something if you get caught with marijuana, but somebody had to bring it here, somebody's dealing it, somebody has the cash, somebody's selling it, and shootings and the stabbings and the home invasions are about drug money, right? This is about drug money. And so we are gonna search these vehicles. We're gonna search plain view stuff for paraphernalia in any car, doesn't matter color, doesn't make a difference to us. What makes a difference to us is the safety of this community, and we're gonna do whatever it takes to get people who are preying on our community out of our community. So, and that is not about color. So, you just ask you questions.
Okay.
This is a question for the researchers. Over time, since you began your data collection and analysis, have the trends in disparities changed? Have they become more disparate, or have they remained the same, or do you see an upward trend?
The disparities have changed. There have been some change. It's been a little bit hard to control because we went from doing 2,000 stops a month to doing about 400 during COVID. And so that is a little bit hard to control given the trend, given the number of stops that have been done. But the disparities have absolutely gone up and down. They've gone up and down over time, and they've gone up and down by agency, right? And a lot of that has to do with search practices themselves over those time periods. Seasonal differences, absolutely.
But
And
most
we-
recently?
We did 2020 and 2021, and now Matt Cravens has the data for 2022. So it's a perfect question to ask as to what's happened since 2021, because we stopped our analysis at that point. So you have almost a whole year of data to look at the trends and disparities and how they shifted over the past year.
So when you
That
said more
is not
recently, so we don't
included.
have 22 data. This is just 21 data.
Got it, so, okay, so that's a question that the community needs to continue to answer, make monitors.
Okay, the question that I have is related to the traffic stops. Isn't it now taken away from the traffic stops that was older? Hasn't that been?
No, so marijuana, you know, is still illegal. The district attorney won't charge for simple possession or, you know, just, you know, born or something. That she was not going to charge for that. And that's her discretion. She doesn't have to. And I think municipal court, or the Lawrence Municipal Court, is the same way. It's a fine. But the actual charge of marijuana is still, it's still on the books. It's still, so if the state decided to, you know, legalize marijuana, there would be no more of that. There would be, we couldn't use them to order marijuana to search a vehicle. There would be no probable cause because it's essentially legalized.
Okay, but the reason for your stop is the overload. And, you know, from my experience in dealing with drugs and people that are using drugs, marijuana is not the cause of all of the other issues that you're talking about.
No, it's not.
The heroin, the
No, it's not.
fentanyl, and all this other stuff. So to me, you're using that as an excuse to pull these people over, charge them, but yet still you're allowing these others to continue to do their dirt. So we've got to come up with a better method in addressing all this other stuff that's causing havoc in our neighborhoods, because it's not actually marijuana.
Right, so it's kind of a two-part, three-part question.
Probably 4 or 5.
Right? But yeah, absolutely. So you're right, when people who use marijuana, you know, you think about people who are just using personal use marijuana, and they just want to be left alone, they want to eat, you know, Taco Bell, eat some bone, and just be done, right? They think it's not a problem. And I understand that. And we're not out to charge or take anybody to jail for that. Like, we don't do that. But the marijuana that's coming in, the fentanyl that's coming in, the heroin that's coming in, the opioids that's coming in, they're all drugs that are in our community, and there's money and guns and shootings and stabbings and all those other things that go along with that. And it's not the person who uses marijuana, it's the dealer, right? We don't know what's in that car, right? And I know exactly where you're going with this, and to a certain extent, sorry, you're right. That gives us a way into that car to make sure that nobody in that car is a felon with a gun, and we would do that whether it was a black person, a brown person, a white person. I mean, if that smell of odor of marijuana is gonna let us get into that car to search that car, there are other things in that vehicle. And those are the things that we're after for our community. Not in particular, like, we're not here to hem somebody up because they got personal use weed. That's just not what we do. But it does allow us the opportunity to get into a car. Same with the white guy. If the white guy has an odor of marijuana, he's getting searched as well. I mean, somebody's grandma is getting searched. It's not legal. And so you're right, fentanyl, heroin, those are huge issues in our community. We can't get those by doing probable cause search. So we have other groups of deputies that are in our Nexus unit, and that is what they do, is they go out and they have to do buys, and they have to set up surveillance, and they have to do those kinds of things to get that out of our community. So we're kind of taking two paths here, but when you're looking at fentanyl, opioids, those kinds of things, when it comes to the dangers of this community, it is absolutely not okay. And we're going after that. We're also going after.
But the other thing is, don't you think that focusing on, okay, let me ask this question. Do you have data that identifies an individual that's been pulled over by marijuana and what of these other drugs that you have found?
So that's the tweak in the report that we're asking, because we talked about, we have.
Could you use a microphone?
That's the tweak we asked for in the report, because that's what we found, right? We found 40% is a search, nothing found. But that isn't necessarily true. Nothing found because it's gone, right? So the perception is we're just searching people to be searching people, and that is not how this works.
No, that's not what I'm looking at. And I understand what you're saying when you say nothing found, but I'm asking, what is found when you search these individuals with the marijuana smell? Exactly what is found and how much of it is found on these individuals as related to all the other things that we've been talking about?
Right. So that's that's going to go back to the form. So the form is probable cause, but it doesn't say what the probable cause is. So that's what I'm saying. We don't have that stat yet, right? So when we have a probable cause search, we have numbers that say so many people got arrested, so many people got cited, so many people got this, so many people got that, 40% not found, which means nothing happens. So we will have that information. We don't have that information now because the form doesn't allow us to do that. But that's what we want to do so we can show the numbers for us and for you in a format that makes sense.
Of the folks that you have found who appear to be dealing drugs, and we have large quantities on their person or whatever, can you speak to the percentages who are people of color?
I think that's something that we'll have to go back and look at reports.
I think that's important.
I think it is. So when we do that, we do send those people to the district attorney's office district attorney's office for charging, no matter gender, color, or any of those things. So, but I understand your point, and yes, we can look at that.
We're documenting data and all this kind of stuff, but we're missing a lot of points. And I think that's where we're having the challenges in our communities, is because you're searching people that smoke marijuana, and most of them happen to be black. It looks like that these individuals are the ones that's bringing the crime into your neighborhood, which is absolutely not true.
Yeah, and there's no correlation to that, right? right? There's no correlation to just because you find somebody smoking personal use marijuana coming or going from our community means that they're dealing with germs and
But don't you think that you're wasting a lot of your time in focusing on that instead of focusing on these other issues that are out there?
So,
Because it takes a lot of time to pull someone over and search them and do your paperwork and all this kind of stuff.
right.
Versus actually focusing on where these drugs are coming in from.
And we're doing both. We're doing both. So again, the drugs that we're talking about, like the fentanyl, the opioids, those drugs, we have a unit that does just that, right? And so we are out focusing on those drugs, but we're focusing on everything that comes to us as well, right? So if we make this car stop and there's an odor of marijuana and that gives us probable cause, then we're not gonna just walk away from that because we don't know what else that they may have, or they may or may not have. So it's not like we're out specifically looking for people to search. That's not what we're doing. So I really appreciate this dialogue. I think this is the kind of dialogue
That we need to have.
we need
You're
to
right.
have.
And it feels like that. It
I
feels
really-
like you're
Yeah.
targeting.
That they were targeting?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because-
Color?
Because of the disparities, and that's, I'm just stating fact.
Okay.
It does feel like it.
The state doesn't mandate you to search just because you smell marijuana.
That's right, it doesn't. But when we have probable cause to do so, what else, we don't know what else is in that vehicle. So we're gonna check. And sometimes we ask for consent, sometimes we like have the other folks that are known drug dealers. We'll ask, we can't do anything about that. The thing about that is, we don't want drugs in our community. All right, that's the bottom line. And I know that there's a lot of
marijuana.
Well, you can
So-
also drive under the influence of marijuana too.
Can I ask a question for clarification? These people were stopped in the first place for something. What I'm interested in knowing is, are they stopping because they are stoned and driving erratically, or are they stopped because they've got a tail light out and then it leads to something else? Is there any way to break that? All of it? Okay.
all of it. I mean, so car stops for us are generally on the highway, so it could be anything, right? It could be night, and most of the time for the searches come at night. So a lot of times it'll be equipment violation, tag light, headlight, brake light. So those are called pretextual car stops. And if we want to get into a vehicle which is legal, okay, probably not gonna like that, or it's legal, it's been to the Supreme Court. But at night, you can't see any of that. We don't even know who's driving at night. So when we make that car stop, and a lot of this is just educational. Hey, I don't know if I have a headlight out or a tail light out or whatever. So those are equipment violations, or hey, you got an equipment violation. But yes, they could lead to anything. You know, if there's plain sight of drugs or paraphernalia or guns or whatever that case may be. So we don't. I'm sorry that it feels like we are targeting any member of our community. Because every member of our community should be safe. Every single member. And so we don't want people to feel like just because you're gonna get pulled over, you're gonna get searched. And I know that the perception of that is for people of color that is what's gonna happen. So.
Could I ask you something else? Would you be able to answer the question of how many people are being pulled over multiple times?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that, but
Right,
yes,
but
yeah,
you
absolutely.
have data.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, every single car stop that we do, we're all connected in the same system. So if that person gets pulled over in Baldwin, we can pull it up. If they get pulled over again in Eudora, then Eudora knows they got pulled over in Baldwin. Same with police department, same with the sheriff's office. So it's all interconnected.
Well, I think maybe taking a look at that and seeing what the numbers show along the demographic lines might be revealing as well. And, you know, part of, you mentioned transparency. I believe it's important for agencies to police themselves. And also, I think I would feel more comfortable that you were making an honest effort if there was a more consistent appeal to the community for their input. And I know there are different groups like JCC and whatever, but I just think it would help to have input from people on how we can help you.
I would appreciate that. And so I'll say to anybody in here, I will meet you one-on-one. If there's a group, you want to set it up. If you want me to come, or the sheriff, or anyone to come, we will come. If you want to come to us and go piece by piece by page by this study, we will go out. We will do that with you as well. And I think that's something that we might.
Also,
So-
there is a history, sorry.
I know you're-
There is a history of people of color being harassed at night, all the way back to slavery and Reconstruction era. So that's something that law enforcement should bear in mind.
Absolutely.
That this really smacks of harassment. So,
I just
not
have one
saying.
thing
So
to leave
I-
with you guys. How often do you as units go out into your communities and attend the kids' games, become a part of the community, and be a positive force versus coming after the individuals because they've done something wrong? Think about it. You need to be there.
So I'm gonna, before, I don't mean to cut you off, we are a few minutes past the library closing, and it's unfortunate that it is right at this point in our conversation, because I would really like to continue that, as I'm sure some of our panelists, I know our audience members would as well. So before we let everyone go this evening, I want to thank our researchers, Dr. McDevitt and Dr. Iwama, and our panelists, as well as a very appreciative thanks to you all as members of the community for coming out, not just for like my first community meeting with you all, but for this particular topic and for the conversation that you all are having as well. And I look forward to working with all of you to as best I can in my particular role to see how we can continue these conversations and the data, and especially working with our panelists and their agencies moving forward to improve the public safety and relationships with law enforcement in Douglas County. So before the library gets